Kurt Garrison with Garrison Forensics with another video. This time we're going to kind of just look at the basics of some terminology for tool marks that be found on fired cartridge cases. So one of the things I actually demonstrated in a post, and a tool that I like to use anytime that I go and testify, is this little plastic model here. It's probably small, about the size of a soda can, but it can be used to demonstrate all the different components, at least of a cartridge. So that is the first thing I want to highlight, is when we have an unfired piece of ammunition, if you have a forensic firearms examiner coming to testify, they're more likely to refer to this as a cartridge. So we're not going to call it ammunition. We're not going to call it a bullet. Always going to refer to this as a cartridge. Now, the different components to a cartridge, one of the components to a cartridge is a bullet. So for example, with this cartridge here, once it is in the firearm and once it actually has been fired, that's generally where we're going to see that the bullet, which is just this component of my full cartridge, is the object that's going to go traveling down the barrel in this case. So this is going to be referenced as the fired bullet. So just a little terminology difference. This is the bullet. The whole thing together is going to be a cartridge. Now moving on, put together a little presentation on this side here, just to highlight some of the terminology that you might end up seeing or hearing if you are listening to a firearms examiner give some testimony. So in this case here, this is a illustration that it's actually used in a lot of different places. This one actually got from an excerpt from a presentation that Lucian Haig did. And again, you actually see this referenced a lot. I'd be surprised if you've seen testimony from a forensic firearms examiner before. You might have seen this used as like a court exhibit before, but it does a really good job in a hand drawing of showing all the different kinds of marks that can be present. And I think noticing, looking at the slide over here, is notice you have a lot of marks that are on kind of the side of the fired cartridge case, which again, fired cartridge case is going to be this component here that's been ejected from generally some kind of semi-automatic firearm. And all these marks are going to be on the case wall, which is going to be this long part here. And so you'll see there's all kinds of different marks that a forensic firearms examiner can actually use to assist in coming to their conclusions. So, and then some of these marks are actually going to be related to firing, and then some of them are related to chambering. So as an example, you can see chamber marks, which is, have all these different arrows going to kind of these short. So if they're truly chamber marks, these are going to be, again, on the case wall, and these are actually generated from the firing process. So as the firing pin strikes the primer, which is this silver portion back here, you'll see there's a little indent back there. It's crushing the primer against something inside the primer called the anvil. That's going to initiate combustion inside of your cartridge, which, remember, the cartridge is the whole thing. The combustion inside the cartridge case pushes the bullet out, but also causes your case wall, this side portion, to expand and actually push against the chamber, which is part of the barrel of the firearm. So as that expands, at the same time that bullet's traveling down the barrel, this is going to start traveling backwards. So as this swells and starts to travel backwards, that's where you're actually going to pick up a lot of these chamber marks. So those marks are actually generated from the firing process, where you have some marks like the slide drag mark, which is up at the top there. That you can actually pick up just from chambering, so not necessarily from the firing process. So some of those subtle differences, if a firearms and tool marks examiner is testifying to something, is an important piece of information to know, because it, again, one could be I just loaded this, did not pull the trigger, unloaded it. Now again, generally, if you're going to load it and unload it, the bullet's still going to be within the cartridge case. But it is good to know that, again, this can just be part of the chamber ring process, not necessarily the firing process. And that would come kind of into effect if you suspect that potentially a fired cartridge case has been loaded more than once. So you can actually recover a fired cartridge case, and you can do it a few times. Eventually it gets kind of worn out and you can't reload them anymore, but you can recover this. You remove the primer that has been crushed. You put a new primer in it. You put new propellant inside your case. You seat a new bullet, and you can actually reuse this. So in that case, you can actually have reoccurring marks on a fired cartridge case, and it could be from the first time it was fired as opposed to the second time it was fired. So then, of course, you can have multiple, some of these sidewall marks especially, you can have multiple ones of them. So again, where the mark can be important, especially depending on the context and some of the case information. Again, then the other kind of part that I want to highlight here, so we talked about the case wall a bit, and we also have the case head, which is going to be kind of the portion where is right here. So this is the case head, and the case head actually has a primer pocket that the primer itself goes into. So if we're looking kind of at the back end, so I always think kind of bullets the front end is the part that's away from the shooter. I consider this kind of the back end. It's kind of the part that's facing a person who is be shooting a firearm. So in this case, generally we have the primer and we have the case head. So if we go back to our illustration, you can actually see you can get marks on the case head specifically. So this slide scuff mark is generally found on the case head. And again, that's going to be something from the chamber ring process. So as the cartridge is getting pushed from the ammunition magazine into the chamber. But then we also have another mark. It's called the ejector mark. Now, generally this one, if you have a very substantial ejector mark, it's generally going to be a firing mark. It's kind of hard to get an ejector mark just from, like if you, again, chambered a cartridge, didn't fire it, and then tried to just, manually unload the chamber by pulling, like maybe the slide of the pistol back. Generally, you won't get an ejector mark from doing it manually. You just can't generate quite enough force to actually cause, at least a significant dent on the case head portion. And then you can also get breech face marks, which are these here, which you can see kind of carry over onto the case head sometimes, but they're mainly found on the primer, which again is this kind of center portion. Again, this model, it's a silver primer, but they can be different types of material. You have a lot of brass primers, which is more of a yellow kind of colored metal. And I would say on the primer, and again, this is where with the reloading process, you're going to have to switch out this primer. So any marks that are on the primer are going to be generally just from one firing incident. You're not going to be able to reuse a primer. It's a one and done situation. So any of your firing pin impressions, which is again the dent that's here, your breech face marks, which are going to be all these lines here, and then you can also have things. If I pull it a little closer, you can have a firing pin drag, which you can kind of see as this kind of upward motion mark that's coming from the firing pin impression and moving up. And then you'll also see there's kind of this donut or ring shape. That's a firing pin aperture. So you can have a firing pin aperture impression, but every once in a while, due to the motion, just like how you can have a firing pin drag that moves up, sometimes this firing pin aperture comes out in enough that you'll actually get a scrape from the firing pin aperture, and you can have what we call firing pin aperture shear. Which I can show another example here. Which here's another example. So this one has firing pin aperture shear. So you can see firing pin impression, firing pin drag, and then firing pin shear. And then you have your breech face marks here, and then some breech face marks on the case head. And then you actually have an ejector mark. And then here they actually have an extractor mark that's on the case head, crosses over into the rim, and will actually go down into the extractor groove, which on our illustration, they have that mark located right here. So here, they just have it kind of on the rim and then inside the groove there. But another thing to point out on here is, here we have a circular firing pin impression with a circular firing pin aperture. And then you notice on this one, you have completely different shapes. So again, that's kind of one of the things that would be a very obvious elimination for us. A firearm that's making hemispherical circular firing pin impressions with circular firing pin aperture is not going to make something with a more oblong firing pin impression with a rectangular firing pin aperture. So moving on, kind of covering some. So again, the illustration's nice, the plastic model's nice, but when it transfers over to the actual fired cartridge case, sometimes some of these marks are a little bit harder to discern. So this is a photo that I actually took as part of a presentation that I did. So here you can see I've labeled an extractor mark, which you can find it in the groove, which is again this nice little groove that's cut into my cartridge case. Here I put a magazine lip mark, which again, that's actually, you have to load a cartridge into a magazine, and as it's getting pushed out of the magazine, sometimes those lips that kind of hold the cartridge down will actually scrape across part of my case wall here as it's being loaded. You also notice I have a feed ramp mark labeled, and this is one I was actually doing the presentation. I've also written a paper on this, but it's still going through the review process, is this magazine lip ejection mark. And that's, again, we use as they develop new firearms and as they develop new types of ammunition, and as we continue to look at all these things, sometimes you'll find a mark that just either it hasn't been utilized a lot, or could potentially be a new mark just because of a new way that a firearm's operating. So in this case, this is the one that I actually was kind of presenting on and doing research on, where again it was a mark from firing, so I only saw this mark when I was actually firing the firearm, but it's a mark that's not coming from the firearm itself, which is the marks that we usually deal with. It's a mark that's coming from the actual magazine that's inside the firearm. So if I was reporting out on this tool mark, I would need to say that this mark is actually consistent as having come from the same ammunition magazine due to firing, as opposed to the same firearm due to firing. So one of those subtle things, but you can see how, looking at the illustration, it's very clear cut. But when you start looking at actual cartridge cases, some of these things can be a little bit harder to see. And then the last portion I want to talk about, because I've been talking a little bit about some of the parts that and parts of the firearm that these marks are coming from. So yeah, I mentioned firing pin impression. So this illustration here, notice it comes from the NIST website, but there's a component called the firing pin. So I talk about the firing pin impression. This firing pin that's inside the Glock, which we're really talking about this in portion here. Usually in a Glock, they call this whole component striker. So if you hear someone refer to like a striker firing pin, they might be used interchangeably. But this end of the firing pin comes through this firing pin aperture and will hit the fired cartridge case, leaving this little dent. In this case, again, the slide looks kind of more like a Glock, but this looks like circular and circular to me. So we'll keep this example. So again, you'll have kind of a hemispherical, or half of a ball-shaped impression, and then you'll see this circular firing pin aperture impression. So firing pin aperture impression is coming from the outline of my firing pin aperture. The actual firing pin impression is coming from the tip of this firing pin, or the striker assembly here. We talked about ejector marks. So the ejector is this kind of little metal component here. So again, that's going to hit the case head, and that is what, as this is getting pulled backwards, it's going to hit that ejector, and that's what actually helps kind of rotate my now fired cartridge case. When I fired it, bullet came out, this comes backwards, hits the ejector. With the ejector and the extractor pulling on it, that's what helps throw the fired cartridge case away from the firearm. We talked about breech face marks, which is again highlighted in blue here. So due to the way that they end up cutting the metal to make the breech face, that's why you end up getting these different, either striated marks. And again, this one, not a lot of striated marks on this one, where this one, has a few more, and they're a little more deep and coarse. So depending on the way they cut this metal will change the way the breech face marks look. And we mentioned slide scuff marks. So there's actually a portion of the slide that, as the slide comes forward, it's going to hit the fired cartridge case on the top of the rim or the case head. So again, it's going to kind of hit the top of the case head. And that's what's going to push this out of the magazine, which you can see the magazine lips here and here. They're kind of black in the image. And those are what will make not only the magazine lip marks, which we talked about, which again are going to be on the case wall portion, and they can be a little bit on the rim as well. But again, as this is getting ejected, depending on the make and model, this is kind of the portion that is going to leave that magazine lip mark. Now as the slide pushes this forward, the chamber portion of the barrel sits underneath the slide around this portion, right above the NIST website. And again, that's where you're going to get some of those chamber ring marks. So you might get a feed brand mark, and then the chamber marks itself, remember, that's from the firing process. That's after you fired it, case wall swells, slide starts moving back in this position where you can see it here. And because of that kind of swelling and then backwards movement, that's where you get chamber marks, different than chamber ring marks. So that kind of covers what I wanted to talk about, just a quick rundown of just marks that you'll find on an actual fired cartridge case, which again is just, it's been fired and there's no bullet, it's been ejected from the firearm. That's what we call the fired cartridge case. It is really easy. Again, if you search, like I just searched cartridge case tool marks, you'll get a lot of good resources. That's again where I found, you'll see I found the NIST website. There's a site called Crime Scene Investigator, which has quite a good like basic articles if you need kind of a primer situation. And again, those Lucian Hague presentations were actually up on there as well. So you can actually find a lot of good information, a lot of good diagrams to kind of educate yourself. But sometimes it's nice to have that person there that has kind of hands-on experience and can interpret all those things for you. Because again, like I kind of point out here, there's a lot of subtleties. Was it a firing mark? Was it a chambering mark? Could it potentially have been reloaded? It's where I have multiple ejector marks, multiple extractor marks, multiple slide scuff marks, and they might not all be from the same firearm, because maybe the guy reloads ammunition and then shares it with his friends. So now you have multiple marks from multiple firearms. So there's ways to tell whether something's been reloaded like that and how significant the marks are that you may be reporting on. And that's some of the help that I'm hoping to offer to people. So again, my name is Kirk Garrison. Again, I have Garrison Forensics as the website. You can go there. I have some blog posts. I'm trying to add blogs kind of weekly, and it's the same time as I do these videos. Sometimes they'll coincide, sometimes they won't. But again, there's another resource, and I'll provide more information to you there as well. So again, thanks for your time. Thanks for listening, especially if you stuck around for the whole video. And I would love if you guys want me to talk about something specific. Put a comment down. I'll do some research. I'll give you my opinion based on my experience. Or if there's even like a popular case out there and you want me to look at some case that's in the news right now, I'll take a look at that. Just put it down in the comments. And of course, liking the video helps, sharing the video helps. And I'm here to help you. So check out GarrisonForensics.org as well. Check out the blog. And again, thanks for listening.